Hey everybody, in this video we're going to look at the basics of solving quadratic equations. Now, what makes a quadratic equation? Well, the quadratic part is the highest exponent of your variable is a square. The equation part just means you're going to see an equal sign. So there's a few different techniques and methods that can be used to solve quadratic equations. You can use something called the square root property. You can use a method called completing the square. You can use a factoring method. You can use quadratic formula to solve quadratic equations. So we're just going to start going through and looking at some of these different methods. Alright, so this first one wants us to solve 2x squared equals 14. So the first method we're going to look at is the square root property. Okay, the square root property says you want to get the squared term by itself. So to get the squared term, the x is the squared term. Okay, so to get that by itself, first thing I have to do is divide by 2 on each side. That's going to give me x squared equals 7. All right, now, remember your ultimate goal in solving equations is to get the x by itself. So to get rid of a square, we have to take the square root. Well, the square root property says when you take the square root of each side, you have a plus square root of 7 and a negative square root of 7. So a square root and a square cancel, leaves me with just x. But when we take the square root of the 7, we actually get a positive square root of 7 and we get a negative square root of 7. So we have two x values. And since the x is by itself, we're done. It's solved for. So that's the first part. The second part says find the x-intercepts of 2x squared, of f of x equals 2x squared minus 14. Well, this is essentially the same thing as what we just did. So when you have f of x equals 2x squared minus 14, to solve these, you would first take this 2x squared minus 14 and you set it equal to 0. And now we want to solve this equation. So what we're going to do is we're going to add 14 to each side. That gives me 2x squared equals 14. And now notice from here, it's going to follow the exact same steps that we did here to solve this. The only difference in part B versus part A is that in part B we're now looking for x-intercepts. Remember, x-intercepts are ordered pairs. At your x-intercept, you have your x value and your y value is always 0. So on this part, when you're looking for actual x-intercepts, you need to write them as an ordered pair. So we know that our x values are square root of 7 and negative square root of 7. So we have square root of 7, comma, 0. Remember, your x-intercept, your y value is 0. And we have negative square root of 7, comma, 0. And there's my two x-intercepts for this problem. And if we look, you can see what the graph of a quadratic equation looks like. It's going to be one of those parabolas. And where it crosses the x-axis, that's where those two x-intercept points are. So over here, we would have the negative square root of 7, comma, 0. And then we would have the square root of 7, comma, 0. Alright, and so that's that one. That's how you use the square root property. Alright, so this one says solve, give the exact solution and approximate solutions to 3 decimal places. Exact solutions are solutions that still have the square root in them. Okay, so we're trying to solve this one. We have 2x squared minus 7 equals 0. Our first step is going to be to add 7 to both sides. Remember, square root property, you're trying to get that square term by itself. So that gives me 2x squared equals 7. Now we're going to divide each side by 2. And we're left with x squared equals 7 over 2. Now get the x by itself. Take the square root of each side. So we're left with x, square root and square cancel, leaves me with just x. And then we have plus and minus, Okay, that's instead of splitting it up as two answers, plus and the negative, we can just use this symbol to represent both of them. So plus or minus the square root of 7 over 2. This is what's called the exact solutions. So we come down here, you have your plus or minus symbol. And then we're going to have 7 over 2. All right, those are your exact solutions. Now, to find the approximate solutions, we're going to go to our calculator. And we're going to go to second, bring up our square root, and we're just going to put square root of 7 over 2. It's set to 3 decimal places, so that's 1.871. 1.871. So we're going to hit this one, and then we want plus or minus 1.871. So your exact solutions are where you leave the square root symbol in it. Approximate solution is when we try to we evaluate that square root and get a decimal. So that's using the square root property. All right. Next, we are going to look at how to solve by completing the square. Okay. So completing the square. Essentially, completing the square is rewriting our quadratic formula in a form to where we can then use the square root property. All right, so this is a little bit tricky, so we'll try to go through this slowly. All right, your first step is to get your x terms on one side by themselves. So we got to get rid of this 24. So we're going to add 24 to each side. So that's going to leave me with x squared plus 2x equals 24. Now what you do is you take the number in front of the b, okay? You take your number in front of the b, which is 2. You're going to divide that by 2. Always divide it by 2, okay? And then you're going to square it. So 2 divided by 2 is 1. And so that would give me 1 squared, which is 1. Okay, so you always take this number in front of the x, divide it by 2, and square it. So 2 divided by 2 is 1. 1 squared is 1. Now, that value that you get, you're going to add that value to each side. Okay? So you're going to add that value to each side. All right? Now, what that allows us to do to this left side is write this left side up as what we call a perfect square. It's like factoring it. So I can rewrite this as x plus 1 squared. X plus 1 squared, if you FOIL that out, will give you x squared plus 2x plus 1. And then 24 plus 1 is 25. Now what we can do to solve this is the square root property. We have our square term, one side by itself equals 25. So I can take the square root of each side. So square root and the square cancel, leaves me with x plus 1 equals, remember, plus or minus, and the square root of 25 is 5. All right, so we got x plus 1 equals plus or minus 5. So this is what's going to now give me my two answers. So we have x plus 1 equals positive 5. We have x plus 1 equals negative 5. And now we want to solve each one of those for x. So here we're going to subtract 1, subtract 1. So x equals 4. Subtract 1, negative 5 minus 1. So x equals negative 6. And there's my two x values. So 4 and negative 6. So 4 and negative 6. And that's how you solve these by completing the square. All right, we're going to look at one more of these. Okay, so here, solve it by completing the square. Let's find another one where we don't have the 2 in front of the x, so we can see something a little bit different. All right, so we'll look at this one. So here, we want to solve x squared plus x plus 4 equals 0. So remember, first step is get the x terms on one side by itself. So that gives me x squared plus x. We subtract 4 to each side, so that gives me negative 4. Now we take the coefficient of the x, so the number in front of x, which is 1. We're going to cut that in half, divide it by 2, and then square it. So 1/2 squared is 1/4. So now we add that to each side. So x squared plus x plus 1/4 equals negative 4 plus 1/4. Now we can write this side up as a perfect square. Okay, so that's going to be x plus 1/2 squared. So if you do 1/2 plus 1/2, that gives you 1. If you do 1/2 times 1/2, that gives you 1/4. Equals negative 4 plus 1/4. Easiest thing to do is just throw this into a calculator. So you have negative 4 plus 1/4. And we'll turn that into a fraction. And that gives me negative 15/4. Now we're ready to solve this using the square root property. So take the square root of each side. Square root and the square cancel gives me x plus 1/2 equals the square root of negative 15 over square root of 4. So what I did there, remember, we had a property that said if you take the square root of a whole, that's the same as taking the square root of the top and the bottom individually. And the reason I want to do that is because I can take the square root of 4. That's a perfect square. So if we simplify this a little bit, that leaves me with x plus 1/2 equals. So the only thing really we can do on the top is we can take out that negative. Okay, we can take out that negative. Remember, when you take a negative out of a square root, it gives you an I. So that's I times the square root of 15 over square root of 4, which is 2. Now remember, we also have, when you take the square root of this side, it gives you plus or minus. So we actually have plus or minus. Okay, and last thing to do is subtract the 1/2 from each side. So that leaves me with x equals negative 1/2 plus minus I square root of 15 over 2. And that represents your two answers. You have negative 1/2 plus I square root of 15 over 2, negative 1/2 minus I square root of 15 over 2. So you would have negative 1/2 plus or minus I square root of 15 over 2. So negative 1/2 plus or minus I square root of 15 over 2. And that's how you use completing the square. That's how you use the square root property. All right, so try some of these problems, see how it works out for you. If it's still giving you trouble or if you have any questions, then please just let me know.